Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another music video. This is my favourite 20 albums of all time. A friend recently asked me to do this list, not on camera, but I just decided to do a video on it just for laughs. So this is my favourite 20 albums of all time. Again, if I do this tomorrow, some of them might be slightly different, but most of them probably wouldn't be. But certainly at number 20, this is an album that I've had for the shortest period of time. I first started getting into music seriously probably way back in the early 80s, so I've been seriously into music probably since about 84, kind of seriously, so that's like 40 years. So for an album to be in my favourite 20, most of these I have had in my life for a long time, but this is the exception. This is from 2020, can you believe it? So I haven't had it for that long. This comes from Greece. And this is Villagers of Ioannou City with Age of Aquarius. This is their second album. I don't have their first album because it's quite difficult to get hold of. I do have their double live album, which has quite a lot from their first album, but maybe one day I'll get my hands on the first album, because strangely enough, just like films, I like to have a physical copy. So this is a 10-track album. And the best way to describe Villagers of Ioannou City, I guess they're kind of space metal, a bit doom, a bit progressive. But the thing that makes this album so amazing is the fact it has one big trip. I mean, there's 10 songs. So for example, the first track is Welcome, which kind of blends into the second track, which is the title track, Age of Aquarius. But the thing that kind of sets them apart are the instruments they use. So there's lots of clarinet, which is maybe a little bit strange for a rock or metal band, but there's lots of clarinet. There's lots of bagpipes, because bizarrely Scotland and Greece have a shared love of bagpipes. But for some reason, the mix of guitars and drums and bass and bagpipe and clarinet just works amazingly well, even though you perhaps wouldn't think it would, but it just works so well. They have a male vocalist, but they also have female backing vocalists. I mean, on stage there's generally quite a lot of band members, so it's just lots of things going on, large soundscape, instruments that you don't usually hear in rock or metal, and it just works so well. It's an album you can just put on repeat, and there's always something to find every time you listen to it, like the best albums. So it's perhaps a little bit bizarre that an album this young would be on this list, probably why it's at 20, but it is such a great album. Again, just like my opinion is not fact. Next, you talk about the big four of thrash being Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth and Anthrax. Personally, I would have this band in the big four, and not Megadeth and Anthrax. It's Testament. And this is the 1999 album The Gathering, which has wonderful artwork. This is obviously the LP. Now, Testament are also from the Bay Area. They were perhaps the kind of second wave of thrash that came a few years after Metallica and Slayer, etc. I love Testament. I think Testament, out of all the kind of, if you want to say the big six or big seven out of thrash, you could argue they're the most consistent. Yes, they had a couple of experiments, such as Demonic, and maybe The Ritual, but on the whole they've kind of kept with their sound. Obviously they've had different drummers and different guitarists. I mean, I love Alex Solznick, the lead guitarist from Testament, and of course arguably my favourite Testament album, The Gathering. Alex Solznick's not actually on it. It's James Murphy. But this album is the album that Dave Lombardo drums on, obviously famous from being in Slayer. Strange enough, the drumming's fantastic. Obviously they'd have Gene Hoglan on a few albums after this, which is also pretty fantastic drumming. But this never lets up. From the opener, DNR, Do Not Resuscitate, which is just such a great song. Down for Life, Eyes of Wrath, True Believer, 3 Days in Darkness, Legions of the Dead. I mean, it is hit after hit. Careful What You Wish For. It's an absolute banger. And you even get lyrics, and there's a band photo. So I mean, Testament are just so consistent if you look at their entire discography, and just like underrated, and they haven't really had a bad album. I mean, I know everybody kind of criticises Demonic for, Chuck Billy and trying to do a bit death metal. Again, Solznick wasn't that album. And initially I really didn't like Demonic. But after listening to things like Nails and Vader, I absolutely love Demonic now, which is obviously not a popular opinion. But there's not a Testament album I don't like, and The Gathering is just an absolute banger. So that's at number 19. Number 18, they had to be on here somewhere. I mean, you could argue that none of their albums are perfect, but this is Coil and Music to Play in the Dark, number 2. Could have went with number 1, or Astral Disaster, or The Angelic Conversation, which is the soundtrack to a Derek Jarman film with the same title. But this is Music to Play in the Dark, Volume 2. Again, Coil, not for everyone. They're kind of experimental / electronic. They're more interested in creepy soundscapes rather than songs. John Balance, the singer, doesn't really sing. A lot of it's kind of spoken word or kind of broken singing. The opening track, Something, just starts like a little earworm with him just saying something, and then it gets louder and louder and louder. Ether, it's either Ether or the other. Paranoid Inlay, Where Are You is brilliant. But the reason that I kind of picked number 2 instead of number 1 is Batwings, a Limno Hymn, which is just absolutely wonderful. I mean, I could have put both volumes 1 and 2 as one entry, but I didn't want to cheat too much. Number 1 has the classic Broccoli. I'm not making this up. Now obviously Coil, a lot of their stuff is just kind of drones, or just way too experimental to enjoy without the help of drugs probably. I wouldn't say this is particularly their most accessible, but certainly it is a perfect album to play in the dark while you're going to sleep. I mean, Coil are one of those bands to play with headphones on as you're drifting off, and you'll probably have sweet, sweet nightmares. Next is an artist that I love, but this is a collaboration. So this is David Byrne and Brian Eno, with Everything That Happens Will Happen Today. Really simple artwork, but these collection of 11 songs, I mean the discs even get grass on it as well, are just typical David Byrne stream of consciousness lyrics, and they are, I hate to say, uplifting and positive, which is kind of the opposite of most of the albums in this list, but they're all uplifting and positive, and it's just spectacular. I mean, One Fine Day and The River and Everything That Happens, the title track, the opener, Home. Most of the tracks for me are like 5-star tracks. I think there's 2 4-star tracks on the album. It's just so wonderful. This is from 2008. I mean, if I ever do a ranked 200 albums, there'd be a few David Byrne albums, but this one is just perfect. So next, I've already forgotten what number this is. It's an album that I have had since it pretty much came out. This was my first grunge album, if you want to call it that. This is Soundgarden and Badmotorfinger. Obviously Super Unknown, their next album in '94, was the big successful one, but I've always loved Badmotorfinger more, because Soundgarden, you know, you had Alice in Chains that were the more metallic, you had Pearl Jam, who seemed to be destined for kind of endless radio play and be the huge success, but they shunned that after their second album pretty much. And obviously you had Nirvana, who were the big success, but Soundgarden, just because the way they wrote their songs, a lot of the time they would just detune one string on the guitar. That's why nobody else really sounds like them. And this album is just full of bangers, as the kids might say. Rusty Cage was Johnny Cash covered in one of his American albums, produced by Rick Rubin. Outshine, Slaves and Bulldozers, Jesus Christ Pose, Face Pollution Somewhere, Searching With My Good Eye Closed, Room 1,000 Years Wide, Mind Riot, Drawing Flies, Holy Water, and New Damage. It's just an absolute masterpiece, and I just love Soundgarden when they're at their slightly off-kilter level. Obviously Chris Cornell, one of the greatest vocalists of all time, Ben Shepherd, one of the most underrated bass players of all time, and Matt Cameron, who of course would play in Pearl Jam, has been in Pearl Jam for a lot of years. So Badmotorfinger has to be on this list. And now an artist that I've only been into for maybe the last 7 or 8 years, who sadly passed away way too young, but again, if you read his autobiography, it's amazing he lasted that long, to be honest. It's Mark Lanegan, who just made lots of albums, was originally in Screaming Trees, but he hated working with his bandmates, and kind of found himself as a solo artist, did lots of side projects. There's a bunch of albums with Isabel Campbell from Belle and Sebastian. That might not be right. But he's got so many great albums, but this is Blues Funeral, fittingly enough, and Mark Lanegan Band from 2012, and this is just absolute gold. From the opening, the Gravediggers song, you've got Harbour View Hospital, which at the time I didn't realise what it was about, but if you read his autobiography, which is one of the bleakest books of all time. Harborview Hospital was the place in Seattle where lots of people who OD'd and had drug problems went. And there's one episode where Mark Lanegan's arm pretty much went to about 6 times its size due to bad drugs. I mean, again, with a lot of Mark Lanegan stuff, he had lots of survivor guilt. Pretty much every musician and singer in the 90s, Mark Lanegan pretty much sold drugs to at one point in Seattle. And he did have survival guilt about all the people that died around him. Quite a few of them he scored with or supplied with. The Gravedigger song, he does call himself the Night Porter because that was his nickname in Seattle for providing drugs to people. There's many an artist that pops up in the book coming to Mark Lanegan's apartment trying to score. Yeah, it's not a happy album, but blimey, it's fantastic. And Mark Lanegan is just one of those guys who has just that hurt voice, but it's also quite beautiful. So next up is a band that I absolutely adore. They're from Germany. They don't exist anymore. They only made 5 albums and then split up. I think they only have like 22 songs. This album's only got 4 songs on it. So you can kind of maybe guess what kind of band it is. This is the Samsara Blues Experiment and Waiting for the Flood. You can tell this is going to be good because that's a Basinski painting, or Beksinski painting, who's an amazing painter who's dead. He was murdered by somebody he gave a job helping around his house, and then that guy murdered him. But this album is just, I mean, the Samsara Blues Experiment, they're kind of prog, doom, stoner, a bit of space, but they're amazing. Every time you listen to it, you get new things out of it. Shringara, Waiting for the Flood, Don't Belong, and Pramin's Lament. That's the 4 songs on it. They're all at least 10 minutes long. They do have songs that are like 22 minutes long. This is from 2013, and it's, you could listen to this all day under the right medication, and you would just find little bits and new moments in it. All their albums are just amazing. They don't have a duff album in the 5. Again, they've only got 22 songs. I think they've got like 3 instrumentals, so they've only got 19 songs with lyrics. The lyrics, there's not a lot of lyrics, but they're kind of strangely profound. English isn't the singer's first language, but that doesn't really matter. If you like your doomer, your doom stoner, progressive, then it's quite amazing. Speaking of amazing, it's actually a singer who makes 2 appearances on Top 20 in different bands, and he also has a 3rd band. This is Puscifer with Maynard James Keenan, and this is Conditions of My Parole, and this is wonderful. This is the 2021 reissue of the album on vinyl, and there's Maynard in disguise. This is just, so Puscifer, some of the members, and there's Maynard James Keenan in prison. Puscifer kind of started as almost a joke band, kind of side project. Obviously Maynard James Keenan's more famous for being the singer in Tool, but then he couldn't help himself, and then at some point Puscifer transformed into just being another great band with profound lyrics, a different sound from Tool, the same way Perfect Circle's different. But this is just absolutely perfect. Not all of their albums are perfect, but this one is a Stone Cold classic. It's just hit after hit. Also the collaboration with Karina Round on this, so you've got Maynard's voice and his range, and then you've got Karina Round's obviously female voice mixed in as well, and the blend of those two voices just make absolute gold. Because again, as serious as Tool are, they've also got a really stupid side, and this is kind of the stupid side, but then it became serious, if that makes any sense. Puscifer started and they had songs, obviously the first album's like V for Vagina, and they have a song Country Boner, which is basically about having sex with all these country music stars. But then he can't help himself, and he's actually made some pretty profound music with Puscifer as well. Next is for me the greatest double album of all time, and that's Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds with Abattoir Blues and The Lyre of Orpheus. Obviously the problem with double albums is how on earth do you make an album or a double album consistent and not with filler, because even the other double albums that get talked about, there's generally some filler, but with the exception of one track, The Fable of the Brown Ape, which closes Abattoir Blues, there's 17 tracks on this double album, and 16 of them are absolute gold. The Fable of the Brown Ape's not bad, but compared to everything else on it, Nick Cave is one of my favourite artists. I do have my top 100 bands, artists ranked, ready to go. I don't know how many videos I might do that. I'm not going to do one with 100. I might do 100 to 51. But this double album is amazing. Both albums by themselves are masterpieces, and then together they're masterpieces, which is hard to do. And it's just been announced that Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, granted there's not that many Bad Seeds left, as far as the originals, not the new originals. They will be releasing a new album June, not quite sure, but there is a new album coming from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Next, from 1973, it's a Frank Zappa album. Now, I don't have all of Frank Zappa. Who does? Frank Zappa, when he's on, to me is an absolute genius, but there's a lot of self-indulgent stuff. I think most Frank Zappa purists would even admit that as well. So this might be too commercial for your hardcore Frank Zappa fan, but this is Overnight Sensation from 1973. It's only got 7 tracks on it, but they are absolutely perfect, and unlike quite a lot of Zappa songs, they don't go longer than they need to be. Plus it does have, it'd be quite nice to get that in vinyl at some point, because that's rather amazing artwork. So as I said, there's only 7 tracks on it, but each one of them is an absolute classic, and is absolutely perfect. So you get Camarillo Brillo, which I have the t-shirt of. Unfortunately it's white, I'd much prefer that to be black, but Camarillo Brillo is an absolute classic. I'm the Slime, Dirty Love, 50/50, Zombie Woof, Dynamo Hum, which is filthy, and Montana, about moving to Montana and being a dental floss farmer. as he rides about in his pygmy pony. Not making this stuff up. And yes, Frank Zappa never took drugs. He was anti-drugs. That's what everybody says about Frank Zappa. Oh, he must have been on drugs to come up with this stuff. He wasn't. All he liked was beer. Every one of these is a classic. And as I said, every single one of them's perfect. So that's Overnight Sensation by Frank Zappa. Might not be wild and crazy and progressive and groundbreaking enough for your hardcore Zappa fan, but I just adore it. Next is an album from 1988, which, as far as I'm concerned, we've had the greatest double album of all time, so now we're going to have the greatest concept album of all time. This is Queensryche and Operation Mindcrime. Still relevant today. It's overtly political, about a nasty professor that takes advantage of this guy who's in Skid Row and turns him into an assassin, taking out political targets and then obviously betraying him. The live concert, Live Mindcrime, which they perform Operation Mindcrime 1 and 2, is quite spectacular. 2 is not as good, strangely enough, but they caught lightning in a bottle with Operation Mindcrime. Again, still completely relevant today, and because it's recorded in a loop, it opens up in a hospital as the main character is remembering what happened to him, and then it ends back in the hospital, so you literally can just put it on repeat. In this lovely special edition you do get a lovely book as well as the CDs with lyrics. There's Speak and Spreading the Disease. It's absolutely fantastic, and again, as it's structured, you can just put it on repeat and just existing in this world where you wake up in a hospital, you're back in the hospital at the end. Oh, it's absolutely brilliant. The playing on it is fantastic. The production is wonderful. It still stands up. It sounds like it was recorded today. The production's that good. If you haven't listened to it, it's such a great album. And then we're getting serious now. This is from 1989. So we've had the greatest double album of all time, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest concept album of all time, as far as I'm concerned, and now we're going to have the most underrated band of all time. It's King's X from 1989, Gretchen Goes to Nebraska. This was the first King's X album I had and heard. I heard the track Pleiades, about the astronomer Pleiades, and I was hooked. I heard it on a radio programme, can you believe that? And just had to get their stuff. I actually saw them and met Doug Pinnick, the bass player, who's now in his 70s and still looks amazing. The reason it's called Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, because the band were challenged to come up with a really silly name that made no sense. So Ty Tabor, the guitarist, came up with Gretchen Goes to Nebraska. And on the inner sleeve, you have the whole story of Gretchen going to Nebraska. They're a power trio. I love power trios. There's one coming up. They're too heavy and too groove-tastic for easy listening, but they're too melodic and too many harmonies for your kind of hardcore metalhead. So they've always been kind of caught between two stools. In their early days, they kind of hung out in the Christian rock scene, so they're kind of labelled as Christian rock, which they're not. I mean, some of them did believe in God at one point, but then that kind of changed, especially in Doug Pinnick's case. Yeah, it's just, they make absolutely beautiful music. Everybody in the metal scene has such respect for them. for their playing, but they're one of those bands that never made any money, despite having like 15 albums, 16 albums. And they always struggle to make ends meet, but as a band, they're just absolutely fantastic. Ty Tabor's like one of the most underrated guitar players. He's got such a sweet tone. Doug Pinnick's bass is amazing, and Jerry Gaskell's drums are just fantastic. But next, a slightly more famous power trio. I've talked about this album before, but this is an album that I hate the production on. I hate the guitar sound because you can hardly hear it. There's not that many guitars on it. I hate the drum sound. But it's an album that I absolutely adore, which makes absolutely no sense. This is from 1987, and I've had it since 1987. And this is Rush, Hold Your Fire. Now, this is an album where people do Rush rankings. This is always pretty much at the bottom. And I get why. Because there's hardly any guitar on it, it's keyboard heavy. Again, the drums sound is terrible, the production in general is terrible, but for some reason I do absolutely adore it, because there's just something about the lyrics by the great drummer who's no longer with us, Neil Peart. There's something about the lyrics that if you listen to the album as a whole, it is very zen, which sounds very pretentious. I mean, there is one called Tai Shan, and they're obviously kind of going for that. Plus, it's the only Rush album that features a guest vocalist, Amy Mann, on Time Stand Still, which again is kind of brilliant and moving about getting older. Again, it's an album, and that's why art is kind of wonderful. Obviously, Hold Your Fire, the title, can mean several things, and not any of them are wrong. It kind of sums up art. A film or an album like this that I should absolutely hate because of the production and because of the way the guitar and the drums sound, but I absolutely adore it, and there's no explanation why. Hold Your Fire, generally voted by everybody as one of Rush's worst albums, but there's something about it that I just absolutely adore. Next, along the lines of Soundgarden, I couldn't even tell you how many times I've listened to this. This is from 1992, an album that is absolutely perfect. An album that I've had on cassette and CD. Should probably get it in vinyl now. This is Alice in Chains and Dirt. Arguably the greatest album to come out of Seattle, period. When singer Lane Staley died, I listened to all of Alice in Chains' discography at the time. Obviously they've come back with William DuVall, and their modern stuff is actually very good. And you realise quite a lot of the songs are about addiction and him dying and death, and that makes it so lovely. But this is one of the most depressing and bleak albums of all time, about addiction and death and drugs. Godsmack, Junkhead, no idea what the songs are about. But the two openers, Them Bones and Damn That River, which are both under 2.5 minutes long. Rooster is obviously the famous one with Jerry Cantrell about his dad who was in Vietnam. But it's just so wonderful. Different textures. Guest vocalist by Tom Araya from Slayer. But it's just bleak and absolutely wonderful. It's now 32 years old and it still stands up. Absolutely amazing album. This one is maybe a little bit lower than perhaps you would expect. From 1986, one of the albums that changed heavy music forever, and that's Rain and Blood by Slayer. Could have picked South of Heaven or Seasons in Abyss. This kind of changes, but I think just for importance, look at that cover as well. You kind of know what you're in for with that cover. Yeah, for importance and 29 minutes of ear abuse. Rain and Blood. I mean, Angel of Death, one of the greatest openers of all time, one of the greatest songs of all time. And no, it doesn't glorify concentration camps. It's just stating fact about Joseph Mengele. Piece by Piece, wonderful cannibal song there. Necrophobic, they'd also have Necrophiliac on Hell Awaits, of course. Lovely cheery double bill. Altar of Sacrifice, Jesus Saves, which is ironic. Criminally Insane, Reborn, Epidemic, which is just pure boogie, Post Mortem, and Raining Blood, which is perhaps a little bit overrated. But how to change the musical landscape in half an hour? Again, I can't tell you how many times I've listened to this. Still stands up. Still perfect. Next, again, it's hard to pick one album from this band. The first band that got me seriously into music and seriously into probably collecting everything, even though I don't actually have everything from this band. I don't have the posthumous album. This is Queen and Queen 2. I mean, Queen 1's fantastic as well and so underrated, but I think Queen 2 is so underrated as well. Everybody talks about Bohemian Rhapsody, but I think March of the Black Queen might be on par or even better. It's certainly right up there with my favourite Queen songs, and it's certainly above Bohemian Rhapsody for me anyway. But this has Procession, which opens with Pomp and Circumstance, then Father to Son, which is amazing, White Queen, which is lovely, because if you go to the Black Queen, you go to the White Queen. Someday, One Day, The Loser in the End, Ogre Battle. It does go into Lord of the Rings and Led Zeppelin. Yes, there were still echoes of Led Zeppelin in their first two albums before they really developed their own kind of sound. The Fairy Fellas Masterstroke, Nevermore, which is a beautiful 1 minute 17. But March of the Black Queen at 6 minutes and 3 is just amazing. Again, it might be my favourite Queen song. It's either that or 39. I love how people go, oh yeah, I'm a huge Queen fan, and then you say March of the Black Queen or 39 to them and they go, what? Because there's kind of massive Queen fans that are only know them for the hits. Funny How Love Is, and the extended, the longer version of Seven Seas Rye. Again, I think it is criminally underrated. Nobody really talks about their first two albums as much, but they really should, because they're absolute classics. And I just picked Queen 2 for having March of the Black Queen and the White Queen on it, and Father to Son, and look, yeah, get the idea. But again, with Queen, I could have picked about 4 or 5. The same with the next band. This will change as well, whichever mood I'm in. But I've went with Iron Maiden's Power Slave. Again, look at the artwork with Derek Riggs. Just spectacular. Again, this has only got 8 tracks. You'll notice with these albums, there's no such thing as filler. There's nothing worse than a band kind of doing 14 tracks when it should have been like 10. But again, record labels are responsible for that to some extent as well. That's what makes Abattoir Blues Lyre of Orpheus such an amazing double album, because there's no filler on it whatsoever. Again, that's just opinion, and opinion is not fact. Only 8 tracks, but Aces High, which is a classic, 2 Minutes to Midnight, which is a classic, brilliant lyrics. Lost for Words, Big Aura, and an instrumental, which they don't do as often. Obviously there's instrumentals in their first 2 albums. Flash of the Blade, The Duelists, Back in the Village, and the Back in the Village, and the Back in the Village again. Power Slave, which is just one of the greatest songs. ever made, and certainly the greatest song about Egypt ever made. And Rime of the Ancient Mariner, again, one of the greatest songs ever written, based on the Coleridge. Because that's the one thing growing up, Iron Maiden taught you about history and poetry and mythology, and they're a walking encyclopedia. Yeah, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, 13 minutes, feels like 4. Because again, there is some kind of alchemy at making a long song feel short. Samsara Blues Experiment does it. I mean, as I said, they've got 22-minute songs, but they feel short. Obviously, Rush 2112, the title track of that album's 20 minutes long, feels like 5. There's nothing worse than a long song that feels long. You know, Frank Zappa with Gregory Peccary, which is 20 minutes long, feels like 40. But Rime of the Ancient Mariner, 13 minutes, feels like 4. An absolute classic, as is Power Slave. But again, like Queen, like Slayer, I could have picked quite a few. As with the following artist, this was again a life changer. If you don't know, I have done 13 volumes of poetry, which are all mediocre, but they're all in book form. And this was really the inspiration to start writing. Obviously, my poetry's bloody awful. But Leonard Cohen, again, I could have picked so many. Songs of Love and Hate. This is the re-release with an early version of Dress Rehearsal Rag. This is the CD, the original. From 1971, again, only 8 tracks. Avalanche, Last Year's Man, Dress Rehearsal Rag, Diamonds in the Mine, Love Calls You By Your Name, Famous Blue Raincoat, which might be the greatest song ever written in the form of a letter. Sing Another Song, Boys, and Joan of Arc. Arguably the greatest song ever written about Joan of Arc. Yeah, this is just pure gold. I mean, Leonard Cohen used to write 100 verses for songs, then whittle them down. Just an absolute genius. He was a poet first, and then picked up an acoustic guitar, and the rest is history. Also a novelist. He could have got away with stand-up comedy because he was hilarious as well. But if you want an introduction to Leonard Cohen, Songs of Love and Hate is a pretty good place to start. Songs from a Room as well, and Songs of Leonard Cohen as well, probably a good place to start. Yes, he has the reputation of for people who want to slit their wrists, but that's just being rather snarky and ridiculous. And of course, people complain about his voice. They complain about Dylan's voice. Now, I think the covers of Dylan are better, whereas when you, because I did have a covers album of Leonard Cohen, and people just don't, it's not the same. So as much as you can complain Leonard Cohen's not a classic singer, when people try and cover his work, it just doesn't work. So that's Leonard Cohen. So we're down to the top 2. And considering I mentioned Maynard James Keenan having 2, it's going to be one of the next 2. So it's number 2. This is Lateralis by Tool, from 2001. Again, I've only really been into Tool since about 2005. And in my favourite band ranking, or my top 100, things have changed, put it that way. But this album, again, it's an album you can put on repeat. Tool's music takes you different places, and again, you can put it on, you can listen to their songs 100 times, and you just get different things out of them, which is the mark of really good music. Again, they're famous for being super serious and mystic, but they're also got lots of songs about bottoms and bottom sex. This, they have interludes which on some albums work better than others. I think on Lateralis it just works so well. Yes, it took 13 years for them to release another album after this due to contract things. But this is an absolute masterpiece. It just works on every level. The production's beautiful, obviously the playing's beautiful because Adam Jones, Justin Chancellor and Danny Carey are just top level musicians, and obviously Maynard with his lyrics always open to interpretation, and that's the way they like it, because they like annoying their fans with trying to work out what songs are about. The Grudge, Parable, Parabola, Schism, the title track, it's just all amazing all the time. So that's Tool, Lateralis at number 2 on my top 20 favourites. But number 1 will probably never change. Again, a band that could have 3 or 4. A band that everybody likes to knock now because of their last 25 years, which is fair enough. But it's the fact that people now want to reassess their first 4 albums that are all gold, but everybody wants to go, well, they're not actually that good. It's Metallica and Justice for All. Now, yes, we know the production doesn't have much bass on it because Lars and James turned it down in the mix to get at Jason, who'd just started in place of Cliff Burton, who had died, who was killed in a bus accident. But the fact that it is just guitars and drums pretty much, it's the most bleak lyrics that James Hetfield ever wrote. It's an album about grief, even though it's political and about society. It's actually about them processing grief. Yes, you could say it's fairly childish to turn down the bass, but again, they weren't that old. People kind of forget Metallica's first 4 albums, they were still young guys and never really processed the loss of their friend. They pretty much took a few months off, hired a new bass player and went back to work. But I mean, Blackened and Justice for All, Eye of the Beholder 1, which is obviously the famous one, about a soldier who's had his arms, legs blown off, he's blind, deaf, dumb, happy-go-lucky stuff. Short Straw, Harvester of Sorrow, which is about infanticide. Frayed Ends of Sanity, To Live Is To Die, which is an instrumental about Cliff Burton, the bass player who died. And Dyer's Eve, about parental abuse. It's a happy-go-lucky album. Yes, you could argue Master of Puppets and Ride the Lightning are better albums, but for me, I've always adored Injustice for All a little bit more, so much so that the tape eventually broke because it was so thin, because the album's 65 minutes long. Again, only 9 tracks, sorry. Just brutal, they're more complex. Obviously after that they would do the Black Album, and you could argue they've never done anything worth talking about since Justice. But because it's just so bleak, it's about the death of their friend, and how they processed it, even though on the surface it's not about that. So it makes sense. It's dry, it's bleak, it's unforgiving. We'd do 3 songs Unforgiven, but that's a different story. It's been my favourite album since 1988, and it's probably not going to change. It's just bleak AF, as the little kids might say, and it is best album lyrically, and Dimension is just so wonderfully bleak. So thanks very much for watching. I know this is music, not films. Some of it's films related. And I will go back to normal film based material after this video. But that's my favourite 20 albums of all time. Please let me know in the comments below how many of these albums you would have in your favourite 20 of all time, or share your 20 of all time. So thanks very much for watching. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.